The Conclave of 12 had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never once failed to resolve a conflict through diplomacy. Their methods were ancient and precise, built upon layer after layer of protocol and tradition, that every spacefaring species learned to respect. Every word spoken in the great negotiation chambers carried the weight of law, and every gesture could seal a treaty or start a war. The 12 founding species had created something beautiful in its complexity, a system where violence became unnecessary because language itself had become the battlefield. But now that system faced a threat it could not handle. The Vorthani Dominion had risen from the outer reaches of the galaxy, like a storm that refused to be predicted. They were massive reptilian warriors who stood 7 feet tall and wore armor made from the bones of their enemies. Their culture valued strength above all else, and they saw the Conclave's endless talking as weakness dressed in fancy. Rogue's 3 border systems had fallen under their shadow, and the species who lived there had sent desperate pleas for help. The aquatic Nilu swam in terror through their flooded cities as Vorthani warships darkened their skies. The silicon-based Groth watched their mining colonies surrounded by hostile fleets. The avian Kathiri abandoned their migration routes rather than fly through contested space war seemed inevitable, and a Conclave scrambled to find a solution. Ambassador Kethrava of the Chithari sat in the emergency council session and listened to her colleagues argue in circles. The Chithari were an insectoid species with compound eyes that saw in every direction and antennae that sensed the emotional currents of any room right. Now those antennae trembled with the sour taste of fear and frustration. The Ilari cannot serve as neutral negotiators, declared Counselor Methax, his crystalline body pulsing with calculated light patterns. They have existing trade agreements with the Nelu that would compromise their objectivity, and the Methax themselves are too closely aligned with the Groth Mining Consortium, countered the Ilari representative, her silver skin shimmering with barely concealed irritation. What about the Harmony Collective? Someone suggested. The Vorthani declared them enemies after the incident at Station Theta 9. The Dreaming Ones. They take 40 years to reach consensus on any matter. Kethrava listened to name after name being proposed and rejected, and she felt a strange thought forming in her compound mind. It was ridiculous, of course, and her colleagues would think. She had lost her sanity, but desperate times demanded desperate measures. What about the humans? She said quietly. The chamber fell silent in a way that made her antennae curl with embarrassment. The humans were newcomers to the galactic stage. Having achieved faster than light travel only 50 years ago, they were considered primitive by most standards. Emotional and unpredictable and utterly ignorant of proper diplomatic customs. Their homeworld was a chaotic mess of competing nations that somehow managed to cooperate just enough to reach the stars. No serious species would ever consider them for a task this important. Ambassador Kethrava, Counselor Methax said slowly, "Surely you are not serious." "I am completely serious," she replied, surprised to find that she meant it. The humans have no existing treaties with any party in this dispute and no economic interests in the contested systems and no political alliances that could compromise their neutrality. They also have no understanding of conclave protocols. The Ilari representative protested. "They would embarrass us all." "Perhaps," Kethrava admitted, "but do we have any other options?" The silence that followed was answer enough. 3 weeks later, a transport ship from Earth docked at Conclave Station, and the gathered ambassadors watched with a mixture of curiosity and dread as the airlock opened. They expected someone impressive, perhaps. A tall and commanding figure dressed in the finest diplomatic attire that humanity could produce. Instead, they got Marcus Coley. Was a man in his late 50s, with gray hair that needed cutting and a suit that had clearly seen better days, perhaps. A decade ago, he carried a battered leather briefcase in one hand and a metal thermos in the other. and he walked with the slightly stiff gait of someone whose knees had filed too many complaints over the years. His face was weathered and lined with the kind of marks that came from too many sleepless nights and too many difficult conversations. Ambassador Kethrava stepped forward to greet him, and her antennae immediately picked up something unexpected. There was no fear in this human, no anxiety about being surrounded by alien species in an unfamiliar place. Instead, she sensed something that took her a moment to identify: patience, deep and vast like an ocean that had learned to wait for the tides. "Welcome to Conclave Station, Negotiator Cole," she said through her translation device. "We are honored by your presence." "Just Marcus is fine," he replied with a slight smile. "And the honor is mine, though I have to admit I am not entirely sure why you folks picked me for this job. You came highly recommended by your government, did they now?" Marcus said with a soft laugh that held no humor. "I suppose they wanted to get rid of me before I caused any more trouble back home." Kethrava was not sure how to respond to that, so she simply gestured toward the corridor that led to the diplomatic quarters. "We have prepared extensive briefing materials for you," she explained as they walked. The complete history of the conflict with the Vorthani Dominion and the cultural protocols of all parties involved, and the 10,000 pages of conclave diplomatic procedures that govern all formal negotiations. Marcus nodded politely, but she noticed that his attention seemed to be elsewhere, studying the station around him with quiet interest. 10,000 pages, he repeated. "That is quite a lot of reading. It is essential that you understand the proper forms of address and the ritual phrases and acceptable ranges of vocal modulation for each species," Kethrava insisted. One wrong word could undo everything. They reached his quarters, and Marcus set down his briefcase and thermos on the small desk provided, looked at the data tablet containing the briefing materials, and then he looked at Kethrava with those strange human eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Ambassador," he said gently, "I have spent 30 years talking people out of doing terrible things, and not once in all that time did I succeed by following a script, but the protocols will still be there tomorrow." Marcus finished. "Right now, I think I would like to get some sleep and maybe find out where a man can get a decent cup of coffee on this station." Kethrava left his quarters feeling deeply uncertain about the choice the conclave had made this human seem completely unprepared for. The challenge ahead, and she could not shake the feeling that they had just invited chaos itself to sit at their most sacred negotiating table. She had no idea how right she was. The negotiation chamber was the most magnificent room Marcus had ever seen, and he had seen quite a few impressive rooms in his lifetime. It was built entirely from living crystal that grew in impossible spirals toward a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the stars themselves. Every surface had been designed to amplify sound, and the acoustics were so perfect that a whisper from one end could be heard clearly at the other. Hundreds of seats rose in tiers around a central platform where the negotiators would stand, and every seat was filled with dignitaries from across the galaxy. Marcus stood at the entrance for a moment and took it all in, while Ambassador Kethrava fidgeted nervously beside him. "Are you ready?" she asked, her antennae twitching with anxiety. "I suppose we will find out," Marcus replied, and he walked toward the floating platform in the center of the chamber. He carried only his thermos of coffee, which had caused quite a stir among the security personnel, who had never seen such a primitive container before. The platform hummed beneath his feet as it lifted him to the proper height, and he found himself facing the most terrifying beings he had ever encountered. The Vorthani delegation sat in a section of specially reinforced seats that could support their massive weight. There were 12 of them, each one a mountain of scales and muscle wrapped in ceremonial armor that gleamed with a dark metallic sheen. Their leader sat in the center, and he was the largest of them all, with scars crossing his face like a map of every battle he had ever won. This was High Commander Vorth Aken. the warrior who had conquered 17 systems and never once lost a negotiation. His eyes were yellow and slitted like a serpent, and they fixed on Marcus with the cold calculation of a predator. Sizing up prey, across from the Vorthani sat the representatives. Of the 3 threatened systems, the Nelu ambassador floated in a specially designed water tank, her blue skin shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that expressed her deep unease. The Groth delegate was a being of living stone, whose face was carved with geometric patterns that shifted slowly to convey emotion. The Kathiri representative perched on a tall stand, her feathers ruffled in a display of barely contained agitation as her keen eyes darted between the Vorthani and the strange human who had come to decide their fate. Marcus set his thermos down on the small podium provided and waited. According to conclave tradition, the challenging parties spoke first, and so all attention turned to Varth Akin as he rose from his seat. The Vorthani commander was even more impressive standing up, and his voice rolled through the chamber like thunder echoing off distant mountains for 17 generations. Varth Akin began. The Vorthani Dominion has suffered insults and injuries from the weak species who hide behind the Conclave's endless words. He spoke of ancient grievances that Marcus did not understand and territorial claims that went back thousands of years. He spoke of Vorthani honor and Vorthani strength and Vorthani destiny. His voice rose and fell in practiced rhythms, designed to intimidate and overwhelm, and the chamber itself seemed to tremble with each pronouncement. 1 hour passed, and then 2, and then 3. Marcus stood perfectly still on his platform and watched Vorthakin with patient attention. He did not shift his weight or check any timepiece or show any sign of the restlessness that was slowly spreading through the assembled observers. He simply listened, his expression neutral and calm. When Vorthakin finally finished his speech, the chamber fell silent with anticipation. This was the moment when the opposing negotiator was supposed to respond with their own carefully prepared statement, matching the Vorthani's intensity with equal force. Every eye and sensor and compound lens in the room turned toward the human Marcus, picked up his thermos and took a long, slow sip of coffee. Then he set it back down and continued to say nothing. The silence stretched for 1 minute, and then 5 Ambassador Keth Rava felt her antennae go rigid with horror as she realized that Marcus was not preparing to speak at all. He was simply standing there, looking at Vorthakin with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been boredom. 10 minutes passed. The Nelu ambassador's bioluminescent patterns began flickering in confused distress. The Groth delegate's stone face shifted through expressions of bewilderment. The Kathiri representative's feathers smoothed, and then ruffled, and then smoothed again as she tried to interpret what she was witnessing. 15-minute tests. Varethkan's scales began to change color, flushing from dark green to a mottled red that indicated profound agitation. In Vorthani culture, silence after a challenge was either an admission of total submission or the gravest possible insult. The commander could not tell which one this human intended, and that uncertainty was clearly driving him to the edge of violence. 20 minutes. The assembled dignitaries began whispering among themselves, their translation devices creating a soft buzz of confused speculation that filled the chamber. Some thought the human had frozen in fear, while others suspected some kind of medical emergency. A few wondered if perhaps humans simply communicated on different timescales than other species. 23 minutes of absolute silence. Marcus picked up his thermos again and took another sip. Then he looked directly at Vorthakin with eyes that held no fear and no submission and no apology. "Is that all you have got?" he said quietly. The chamber exploded. Vorthan roared with fury and slammed his armored fist against his seat, cracking the crystal beneath it. His guards leaped to their feet with weapons drawn, while the other Vorthani shouted accusations of insult and dishonor. The conclave observers erupted in panic chatter as security drones swarmed toward the central Platform Ambassador Kethrava buried her face in her 4 hands and wondered how she would explain to her government that she had single-handedly destroyed 10,000 years of galactic peace. But through all the chaos, Marcus Cole remained exactly where he was. Standing calmly on his platform, with his thermos in hand, he watched the uproar around him with the patient expression of a man who had seen far worse in basement apartments and back alleys across a dozen Earth cities. He had worked with drug lords and terrorists and desperate people with nothing left to lose. A room full of angry aliens was barely enough to make him raise an eyebrow when the security chief demanded to know what he had been thinking. Marcus simply shrugged. "I was thinking," he said, "that a man who needs 3 hours to say what he wants probably does not know what he wants." He took another sip of coffee. "Tomorrow we can talk about what he actually needs." And with that, he stepped off the platform and walked out of the chamber, leaving behind a galaxy that would never quite see humans the same way again. The emergency session lasted 14 hours and accomplished absolutely nothing. Conclave. Legal scholars argued in endless circles about whether Marcus had violated 17 different protocols or somehow invented an entirely new category of diplomatic offense that had no precedent in 10,000 years of galactic law. The Vorthani demanded his immediate removal and formal apology. The threatened systems were terrified that their last hope had just insulted his way out of relevance, and through it all, Marcus Cole sat in his quarters, drinking coffee and refusing to see anyone. Ambassador Kethrava finally managed to gain entry on the 3rd day, when she brought a peace offering of something called donuts that the human embassy had shipped. On an emergency transport, she found Marcus sitting by the window, staring out at the stars with that same patient expression she had noticed when he first arrived. "The conclave is in chaos," she told him, her antennae broadcasting her frustration. "Everything we have built is falling apart, and you are sitting here eating pastries. These are actually quite good," Marcus said, examining a donut with powdered sugar. "Did the Vorthani agree to meet with me again? What makes you think they would ever agree to that?" "Because Vorthakan has not left the station yet." Kethrava paused, and her compound eyes blinked in surprise. "You are right," she admitted. "He has been demanding your punishment, but he has not actually departed, and his fleet remains in holding position. If he truly believed I had insulted him beyond repair, he would have walked out immediately," Marcus explained. "That is what a man does when his pride is wounded past the point of recovery. But Vorthakan is still here, which means he is curious." Curious about what? About what happens next. The following morning, Marcus requested private meetings with each delegation, and to everyone's amazement, they all agreed. He started with the Nelu ambassador, meeting her in a specially designed chamber that was half filled with the warm salt water her species needed to survive. She floated before him with her bioluminescent patterns pulsing in wary blues and greens. "I know very little about your people," Marcus admitted. "Would you tell me about your world?" The Nelu ambassador had prepared for many possible approaches from the human negotiator, but simple curiosity was not among them. Slowly, and with growing confidence, she began to describe her homeworld. She spoke of cities built beneath endless oceans where her people had lived for millions of years. She described the great coral cathedrals where they gathered to sing, and the deep trenches where they farmed luminescent creatures for food. Her pattern shifted to warm oranges and yellows as she talked about her children and the schools where they learned to navigate the currents. Marcus listened and asked questions, and took notes in a battered notebook that looked older than some civilizations. Did not interrupt or redirect, or try to steer the conversation toward the negotiation. He simply paid attention in a way that the Nelu ambassador realized she had never experienced from another species before. "Why do you ask these things?" She finally wondered. "What does this have to do with the Vorthani threat? I cannot help you if I do not understand you," Marcus replied. "And I cannot understand you if I do not know what matters to you." He met with the Groth delegate next, learning about their silicon-based biology, and their deep connection to the mineral wealth of their planet. The Groth spoke slowly, their stone faces grinding through expressions with geological patience. They told Marcus about the sacred caves where new Groth were born from the living rock and the ancient mines that their ancestors had worked for 100,000 years. The Catheri representative was more difficult because her species communicated through subtle feather movements and vocal harmonics that the translation devices struggled to convey. Marcus asked her to teach him a few basic phrases in her native language and spent an hour practicing sounds that his human throat was never designed to make. He failed miserably at the pronunciation, but the Catheri seemed deeply moved by his effort. No outsider has ever tried to speak our tongue, she told him, her feathers settling into a pattern of cautious respect. And no outsider has ever truly listened to you. Marcus said. Word of these meetings spread through the station, and something strange began to happen. The delegates who had spoken with Marcus started talking to each other. The Nelu ambassador shared stories of her homeworld with the Groth delegate and discovered that they both placed profound importance on ancestral traditions. The Catheri representative learned that the Groth had once faced a similar territorial crisis and had nearly gone to war before finding a peaceful solution. These conversations happened outside the formal negotiation chambers, in corridors and common areas where protocol held less power. They were messy and unstructured and would have horrified any proper conclave diplomat, but they were also real in a way that scripted speeches could never be. Ambassador Kethrava watched this unfold with growing amazement, and she began to understand what Marcus was doing. He was not negotiating at all. Not in any way the conclave would recognize. Instead, he was dismantling the performance. For 10,000 years, galactic diplomacy had been theater, with every participant playing their assigned role according to ancient scripts. The Vorthani played the aggressive conquerors, while the threatened species played the helpless victims, and the conclave played the wise arbiters who dispensed justice from on high. But Marcus refused to play any role at all. He asked questions instead of making statements, and he listened instead of lecturing, and he treated every being he met as a person rather than a representative of their species, without a human-shaped piece on the board. The entire game became meaningless. The other players did not know their lines anymore, and so they started improvising, and improvisation, Kethrava realized, was just another word for genuine conversation. On the 8th day, Varthken finally agreed to a private meeting. The Vorthani commander had spent the week watching the chaos unfold and trying to understand what kind of strategy the human was employing. He had consulted with his advisors and studied recordings of every meeting, and still he could not predict what Marcus would do next. That unpredictability was maddening, but it was also fascinating. No opponent had ever confused Varthken this thoroughly, and the warrior in him wanted to understand how this small, soft creature had managed to destabilize an entire galactic institution with nothing more than silence and questions. Very well. The commander finally told his guards, "Bring me this human and let us see what game he truly plays." Marcus received the summons with a quiet nod. Finally, he said to Ambassador Kethrava, "Now the real work begins." The meeting room was designed for Vorthani comfort, which meant it was too warm and too dark for human preferences. Marcus did not complain. He simply walked in and took a seat across from the most feared military commander in the galaxy. Vorthken had dismissed his guards for this meeting, which was either a sign of respect or a sign that he wanted no witnesses for whatever was about to happen. The massive reptilian sat in a reinforced chair that groaned under his weight and studied Marcus with those cold yellow eyes. "You have caused considerable trouble," the commander said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "I have been told that is one of my talents." Marcus replied, "The conclave wants me to demand your removal from these negotiations." "Do you want that?" Vorth Akin was silent for a moment, and his scale shifted through several shades of color that Marcus could not interpret. "I want to understand you," the commander finally said. "I have conquered systems and crushed armies and bent entire civilizations to my will, but I cannot predict what you will do next, and that disturbs me." Good. Uncertainty is the beginning of wisdom," Marcus said. "A man who thinks he knows everything has already stopped learning." "Is that human philosophy?" "That is something my grandmother used to say, and she was the wisest person I ever knew." Vorthagen made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. The difference was not entirely clear. "Your grandmother sounds like a formidable warrior. She raised 7 children during a war and kept them all alive and fed on almost nothing," Marcus said. "I would put her against any army." The commander's scale settled into something that looked almost like amusement. "Ask your questions, then," he said. "I know that is what you do, and I am curious what you think you can learn." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Why do you need those 3 systems?" "For the glory of the Vorthani Dominion and the expansion of our territory, and them?" "No," Marcus interrupted gently. "That is what you told the Conclave, but that is not why you need them, and I am asking why you need them." Vorthagen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You dare to call a Vorthani commander a liar?" "I am calling you a leader," Marcus said. "And leaders always have 2 sets of reasons for what they do. The reasons they tell others and the reasons they keep to themselves." The room fell silent, except for the low hum of the environmental systems. Marcus waited with the patience of a man who had once spent 42 hours talking a desperate father out of doing something terrible to his family. He had learned long ago that silence was a tool more powerful than any weapon. Most people could not stand emptiness, and they would rush to fill it with words, often with truths they had never intended to share. Vorthagen lasted longer than most, but eventually even he succumbed. The commander stood abruptly and began pacing the room, his massive form casting shadows that danced across the walls. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The theatrical rumble was gone, replaced by something rawer and more real. "The translation matrix is still active," Marcus noted. "I know," Vorthagen said. "But there are things that cannot be translated and things that should not be." He stopped pacing and turned to face the human. "My people are dying," he said. The words hung in the air between them. "Our homeworld grows cold," Vorthagen continued. "For 10,000 years our sun has been weakening, and each generation the temperatures drop a little more and the breeding pools grow a little shallower and fewer eggs survive. The winter." Marcus said nothing, but his expression had changed. "Scientists tell us we have 3 generations left," the commander said. "Maybe 4 if we are fortunate, but the Vorthani have never been fortunate." He sank back into his chair, and for the first time Marcus saw something other than strength in the massive warrior. He saw exhaustion and fear and the terrible weight of responsibility that came with knowing your people faced extinction. "Thermal vents in those 3 systems could save us," Vorthagen explained. "The heat they generate is exactly what we need to warm our breeding pools and ensure our eggs survive and give us time to find a permanent solution." "Why not simply ask for access?" Marcus said. The commander's scales flushed dark red. "We are Vorthani," he growled. "We do not beg. Asking is not begging. For my people, it is the same thing," Vorthagen said. "Our entire culture is built on strength and conquest and taking what we need, and if we show weakness, then we become prey for every other species that has ever envied or feared us." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that made the Vorthani commander freeze in shock. He stood up and walked around the table. He did not stop at a respectful distance, as diplomatic protocol demanded. He walked until he was standing right next to Vorthagen and then he sat down on the floor, beside the commander's chair. "What are you doing?" Vorthakin demanded. "I am sitting with you," Marcus said simply. "Not across from you as an opponent, but beside you as someone who understands. You cannot possibly understand. I spent 30 years talking to people in the worst moments of their lives," Marcus said quietly. "People who had lost everything or were about to lose everything and saw no way forward except through violence." He looked up at the massive warrior beside him. "I know what it looks like when someone is fighting because they are afraid," he said. I know what it looks like when they are too proud to admit it even to themselves." Vorthakin was silent for so long that Marcus began to wonder if he had miscalculated. Then the commander spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I have led my people for 40 years, he said. "I have won every battle and conquered enemy, and yet I cannot save them from this and every night. I lie awake knowing that history will remember me as the commander who led the Vorthani to extinction. That does not have to be your legacy. What other choice do I have?" Marcus reached out and placed his hand on the commander's massive armored forearm. It was an insane gesture that should have gotten him killed instead. Vorthakin simply looked at the small human hand, resting against his scales with something like wonder. "You cannot beg for what you need," Marcus said. "I understand that, and I will not ask you to." "Then, what do you suggest? What if you did not have to ask for it at all?" Marcus said. "What if you could offer something so valuable that the other species would beg you to take what you need?" Vorthakin's eyes narrowed with interest. "What could we possibly offer them?" Marcus smiled. "Let me tell you about a concept my people call partnership." The final session of the negotiation took place in the same crystalline chamber where everything had begun. The same hundreds of dignitaries filled the same rising tiers of seats, and the same recording drones hovered above to capture every moment for posterity, but everything else had changed. The Vorthani delegation sat in their reinforced section, but their body language was different. Now Vorthakin still wore his ceremonial armor, but his scales had settled into calm greens instead of aggressive reds. The warriors beside him watched the proceedings with something that looked almost like hope across from them. The representatives of the three threatened systems waited with cautious anticipation. The Nulu ambassadors' bioluminescent patterns pulsed with nervous excitement. The Groth delegate's stone face had shifted into an expression of careful optimism. Kathiri representative's feathers were smooth and still as she watched Marcus take his place on the central platform. Ambassador Kethrava sat in the observer section and felt her antennae trembling with an emotion. She could not quite identify she had watched this human stumble into their carefully ordered galaxy and proceed to shatter every expectation and every protocol and every assumption about how diplomacy was supposed to work now. She was about to see whether any of it had actually accomplished anything. Marcus cleared his throat and looked around the chamber. "I am not going to give a speech," he said. "You have all heard enough speeches to last a lifetime, and most of them did not mean anything anyway." A kind of ripple of surprise passed through the assembled dignitaries. "Instead, I am going to tell you what I learned over the past 9 days." Marcus continued. "I learned that the Nelu have children who dream of swimming through the stars, and that the Groth remember every ancestor who ever lived in the stone of their bodies, and that the Kathiri sing songs that take 3 generations to complete." He paused and looked toward the Vorthani section. "And I learned that the Vorthani are not the monsters that everyone believes them to be, but rather a proud people facing a crisis that would terrify any species in this galaxy." Murmurs spread through the chamber as observers tried to understand what the human was implying. "The Vorthani homeworld is dying," Marcus said plainly. "Their sun grows cold, and their people face extinction within 3 generations unless they find new sources of thermal energy." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers, but Varthakin remained still. He had agreed to this. Marcus knew, though it had taken hours of conversation to convince him that vulnerability could be strength. The thermal vents in the 3 contested systems could save the Vorthani species. Marcus continued, that is why they need those systems. And that is why they were willing to go to war for them. The Nelu ambassador's patterns flickered with confusion and then understanding. They were not invading for conquest. She said slowly, they were fighting for survival. Yes, why did they not simply tell us? Because asking for help is not something their culture permits. Marcus explained, for the Vorthani, any sign of weakness is an invitation to attack, and so they chose to threaten war rather than admit they were desperate. He turned to face Vorthakin directly. But there is another way, he said. A way that does not require anyone to beg or surrender or admit defeat. Marcus pulled out his battered notebook and flipped to a page covered in his cramped handwriting. The Nelu have the most advanced aquaculture technology in the galaxy, but their systems are constantly threatened by raiders because they have no military to speak of. He looked at the Groth delegate. The Groth have mineral wealth beyond measure, but lack the population to properly defend their mining operations. He looked at the Catheri representative. The Catheri have navigation knowledge, accumulated over millions of years of migration, but they avoid conflict at all costs, which makes them vulnerable to anyone willing to use force. Marcus closed his notebook, and the Vorthani have the most powerful military in 3 sectors, but face extinction because their world cannot provide what they need to survive. He spread his hands. Each of you has something the others need, and each of you lacks something the others have, and the solution is so obvious that I am amazed no one saw it before. What solution? Vorthakin demanded, though his voice held curiosity rather than challenge. Partnership, Marcus said. Not conquest and not surrender, but genuine partnership. He began pacing the platform as he explained. The Vorthani receive permanent access to the thermal vents they need, but not as conquerors and not as beggars, but as partners who bring something valuable to the arrangement. What would we bring? One of the Vorthani warriors asked skeptically. Protection. Marcus said, your fleets would defend all 4 species against any external threat, and in exchange, you would receive the energy resources you need to survive, and the Nelu would receive military protection for their aquaculture systems, and the Groth would receive defense for their mining operations, and the Catheri would gain safe passage through every sector. Controlled by the Alliance, the chamber had fallen completely silent. You are proposing a new alliance. Ambassador Kathrava said slowly, not a negotiated settlement, but an entirely new political entity. Yes, that is unprecedented. So was a human standing in this chamber 9 days ago. Marcus replied, precedent is just another word for the way things used to be done, and sometimes the old ways stop working. The voting took 3 hours conclave. Legal scholars argued that the proposal did not fit any existing framework, while others countered that no existing framework had solved the problem anyway. The Nilu deliberated among themselves, their patterns cycling through every color of the emotional spectrum. The Groth delegate meditated in perfect stillness as geological thoughts moved through their silicon mind. The Catheri representative sang quietly to herself, a decision-making ritual her species had used for millennia, and Vorth Akin sat in his seat and watched. Marcus, with an expression that had shifted from hostility to respect to something that might almost have been friendship. When the final count was announced, the vote had passed by the narrowest margin in conclave history. Chamber erupted in a chaos of reactions as thousands of years of political assumptions were overturned in a single moment. Ambassador Kathrava found Marcus standing alone near the Bayon exit while the celebration and arguments swirled around him. How did you do it? She asked. You had no training and no knowledge of our ways, and no understanding of our protocols, and you brought only silence and chaos. Marcus smiled. The tired smile of a man who had seen too much and helped too many. "Where I come from, we learned something a long time ago," he said. "The loudest voice in the room usually has the least to say, and the person ready to burn everything down is usually the one most afraid of being alone." He picked up his thermos, which had somehow survived the entire negotiation. "I just listened," he said. "Really listened, and it is amazing what people will tell you when they realize you actually give a damn." Kethrova watched him walk toward the docking bay, where a transport was waiting to take him back to Earth. She suspected he would refuse any honors or recognition and simply go back to his quiet life, as if he had not just reshaped the political landscape of an entire galaxy. Behind her, Varthican approached with heavy footsteps, a remarkable creature. The commander said, "I have never met anyone like him." "No one has," Kethrova agreed. "Do you think there are more humans like him on their world?" Kethrova considered the question carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should be very grateful. They seem to prefer peace over conquest, because if humans ever decided to take over the galaxy, I suspect they would do it before any of us realized what was happening." Fourth Akin made that sound that might have been a laugh. "Then let us hope they remain our friends." He clasped Kethrova's smaller hand in his massive grip. A gesture he had learned from Marcus. "Come," he said. "We have a new alliance to build, and I suspect it will require skills that no Vorthani commander has ever needed to learn." Such as Vorthakin smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth in an expression that would have terrified anyone who did not know what it meant. "Listening," he said. "Really listening." And together they walked back into the chamber to begin the hard work of building something new from the beautiful chaos that one quiet human had left behind.